He told me I was too stupid to understand what a spoiler was. So I made sure he never got to experience the ending of his favorite 14-book fantasy series the way it was meant to be experienced. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I didn't break subreddit rules. I simply pressed send and erased months of anticipation from his life. If you've ever had someone talk down to you online like you were beneath them, like your intelligence was negotiable, then stay with me, because this revenge wasn't loud. It was surgical. Before we dive in, if you believe disrespect deserves consequences, even the quiet kind, hit that like button and subscribe. And while you're at it, comment below, what's something small that someone overreacted to in your life? Trust me, by the end of this story, you'll understand why this one still makes me smile. I need you to understand something about me first. I'm not impulsive. I'm not dramatic. I'm not someone who lashes out without thinking. I'm the quiet one in the room, the observer, the girl who listens more than she speaks, the girl who notices tone shifts, the girl who remembers exactly what someone said 3 months ago and how they said it. And I love fantasy novels. Not casually. Not I read sometimes. I commit. I study lore. I map bloodlines in my head. I cry over fictional deaths like I've lost family members. Books have always been my safe place. When life felt unstable, stories were structured. When people disappointed me, characters followed arcs. Fantasy, especially, gave me worlds where actions had consequences, where arrogance eventually met justice. This particular series, 14 books, thousands of characters, political intrigue, prophecies, betrayals layered so deeply that you had to reread chapters to catch the foreshadowing. It took me almost a year to finish, late nights under warm yellow light, my phone face down so notifications wouldn't break immersion. I remember finishing book 6 at 3:17 a.m., staring at the ceiling because my heart wouldn't slow down after a cliffhanger. I remember book 9 physically hurting. I remember book 12 making me gasp so loudly my roommate thought something had happened. These weren't just books. They were experiences, naturally. When I finished the series, I wanted to talk about it. That's what fandoms are for, right? Discussion, theories, shared emotional trauma. So I joined the subreddit dedicated to the series. It felt like finding my people. Posts dissecting symbolism, debates about morally gray characters, fan art, inside jokes only readers would understand. It felt safe, intelligent, passionate, the kind of place where loving something deeply wasn't embarrassing. One afternoon, someone made a general discussion post about character development across the series. It wasn't marked as spoiler-free. It wasn't restricted to early books. It was broad, open. I commented casually, referencing a supporting character that appears later in the series. I typed her name, just her name, no description, no arc explanation, no death reveal, nothing. Just the name as part of a larger point about how side characters evolve over time. Within minutes, I got a reply. Wow, thanks for the spoiler. At first, I actually smiled a little, thinking it was sarcasm. It wasn't. I responded politely. I said something like, it's just a name. There are over 2,000 named characters in this series. I even added a smiley face to soften it. That's when his next message came. Some of us are still reading. Knowing future characters exist changes the experience, but I guess that concept is too complex for you. I felt that first small flicker in my chest, not rage, not yet, just discomfort. Like when someone slightly mispronounces your name on purpose. I replied again, still calm. I explained that in a 14-book epic, the existence of more characters is implied. That's how long series work. I told him I hadn't revealed any plot points, no context, no outcome. Just a name in a sea of names. His response escalated, fast. You're either being intentionally dense or you genuinely don't understand how spoilers work. Intentionally dense. I read it twice. Then 3 times. My shoulders stiffened. I could feel heat creeping up my neck. I typed back carefully, choosing restraint over pride. I said I disagreed, but if it truly bothered him, I was sorry he felt that way. That should have ended it. A normal person would have either dropped it or moved on. He didn't. People like you ruin communities. Zero self-awareness. Low IQ energy. Low IQ energy. That's the exact phrase. It's funny how strangers online feel bold enough to say things they would never say face to face. I remember staring at my screen, my reflection faintly visible against the dark mode background. I'm not insecure about my intelligence. I know what I'm capable of. But there's something about being talked down to by someone who thinks they're morally superior. The T scratches at something primal. I tried one last time. It was a name, that's all. And that's when he sent, just admit you messed up instead of embarrassing yourself further. Embarrassing myself. It's wild how quickly the dynamic shifted. It wasn't about spoilers anymore. It was about dominance, about him wanting to win. About him needing to position himself as the smarter one, the guardian of reading purity. And suddenly, I wasn't just defending a comment. I was defending myself. Here's the thing he didn't realize. By accusing me of spoiling a future character, he accidentally revealed something. He hadn't even reached the middle of the series, which meant he had no idea what was coming, no idea who dies, no idea which betrayals reshape the entire political structure of that world, no idea about the final battle, the sacrifice, the twist about the true villain. He was still walking into every emotional landmine blindly, and he thought I had ruined something for him. That's when the anger changed texture. It cooled, it sharpened. My breathing slowed. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, not in defense but in contemplation. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't furious. I was calculating. He wanted a spoiler. He wanted to accuse me publicly of damaging his experience. Fine. I would show him what actual damage looks like. And the most beautiful part, I wouldn't even break the rules. That's when I clicked on his profile, and that's when the idea truly formed. When I clicked on his profile, it wasn't out of curiosity. It was reconnaissance. There's a difference. His comment history told me everything I needed to know about the kind of person he was: condescending, nitpicky, the self-appointed gatekeeper of multiple fandoms, correcting grammar in casual posts, arguing over interpretations like they were objective facts, calling people casuals for not memorizing minor lore details. It wasn't about passion. It was about superiority. He didn't just love stories, he loved feeling smarter than other people because of them. And suddenly, the insult about my intelligence made perfect sense. This wasn't about a name, it was about ego. I kept scrolling. I saw posts where he proudly mentioned he was on book 5 of the series, book 5. Out of 14. That meant 9 entire books of plot twists, betrayals, deaths, alliances, revelations, secret identities, final battles. 9 books of emotional investment were still ahead of him. I could almost picture him reading late at night, heart racing at cliffhangers, forming theories in his head about who the true villain was, who would survive, who would fall. Anticipation is half the joy of a long fantasy series, the slow burn, the speculation, the guessing. And in that moment, I realized something powerful. I held the ending, not physically, but in memory. I had already walked the path he was still traveling. I knew where every road led. My initial instinct was to let it go. I won't pretend I'm some villain who immediately jumped to destruction. I actually sat there for a good 10 minutes staring at my screen, asking myself if it was worth it. It's just a stranger. It's just words, why care? But here's the thing about disrespect, it lingers. His phrases replayed in my mind: low IQ energy, too complex for you, embarrassing yourself. It wasn't playful teasing, it was intentional belittling. He wanted me to feel small, and maybe that's what bothered me most. Not that he disagreed, but that he assumed intellectual authority over me without knowing anything about me. I've dealt with that tone before, in classrooms, in meetings, in group projects where men would repeat my ideas louder and get credit for them. That subtle, dismissive energy that says, you don't understand this as well as I do. So this wasn't just about a book anymore. It tapped into something older, a familiar pattern, and suddenly, it wasn't petty. It felt symbolic. I went back to the thread. He was still responding to other people, doubling down, portraying himself as the victim of spoiler culture. A few users mildly disagreed with him, pointing out that a name alone isn't a spoiler. He brushed them off, but he kept referencing me indirectly. Some people just lack reading comprehension. That was the moment the last thread of hesitation snapped. It wasn't enough for him to insult me privately. He wanted an audience. Fine. If he wanted drama, I would give him a private performance. He'd never forget. I clicked send message. My fingers rested on the keyboard, and here's where the psychology gets interesting. Revenge, when done impulsively, is messy, it's sloppy, it leaves you exposed. But revenge done calmly, that's art. I didn't want to rant. I didn't want to curse him out. I didn't want to break subreddit rules and get banned. No. I wanted precision. I wanted inevitability. I started with something simple. Hey, since you feel like I spoiled something for you, I'd hate for you to misunderstand anything else moving forward. I stared at the sentence. Polite, neutral, almost helpful. Then I began typing. I listed the first major death, the one that shocks everyone around Book 8. I described exactly how it happens. Who betrays who, what final words are spoken. I didn't rush it. I took my time, making sure it was clear but not dramatic like a summary. Then I moved to the political coup in Book 10. Explained which kingdom falls and why. Then I told him the truth about the supposed big bad. The twist that reframes the entire narrative. The hidden manipulator operating behind the scenes. The real motivation that only becomes clear in the final chapters of Book 13. My heart wasn't racing. That surprised me. I expected adrenaline. Instead, I felt steady, focused, almost detached. I continued. I told him who survives the final battle, who sacrifices themselves, who gets the throne. I even described the epilogue, the quiet aftermath, the marriages, the broken alliances, the unresolved tensions, and because I knew he prided himself on theorizing, I added something extra. I included 3 popular fan theories about what happens 20 years after the series ends. The kind of speculation that usually takes readers hours of forum scrolling to discover. By the time I finished typing, it was long, detailed, irreversible. I reread it once. Not to edit, but to feel the weight of it. This wasn't a vague hint. This wasn't a half spoiler. This was annihilation. Months of anticipation collapsed into one private message. I hovered over the send button. There was still time to back out. I could delete it, close the tab, be the bigger person. That's what we're always told, right? Be mature, rise above it. But maturity doesn't mean accepting disrespect, and rising above doesn't always mean staying silent. Sometimes it means choosing your battlefield. He chose public condescension. I chose private devastation. I pressed send. For a moment, nothing happened. Of course, nothing happened. It was ADM. There's no dramatic explosion, no cinematic soundtrack, just a small notification that the message had been delivered. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of my laptop fan. I didn't feel guilt. I waited for it, but it didn't come. Instead, there was a strange sense of balance, like a scale that had been uneven was finally level again. About 15 minutes later, my inbox notification blinked. He had replied, and the first word of his response told me everything I needed to know. Wow. Not sarcasm, not arrogance. Shock. Asterisk. His reply came faster than I expected, just one word at first. Wow. I stared at it for a few seconds, my face completely expressionless. But inside something shifted. That wasn't sarcasm. That wasn't arrogance. That was shock, trying to process trauma in real time. A few seconds later, another message appeared. You're kidding, right? I didn't respond. I wanted silence to do the work for me. There is something psychologically destabilizing about being flooded with information and then met with quiet. It forces the other person to sit in it, to reread, to replay, to feel. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then came the longer message. What the hell is wrong with you? Why would you send that? I didn't even read it all, but I saw enough. I could almost see him scrolling too fast, realizing too late that the damage was already done. The human brain doesn't unsee things. Once you know who dies, you know. Once you know who betrays who, every earlier interaction becomes suspicious, suspense evaporates, anticipation dies. And that's when it hit me fully. I hadn't just spoiled plot points, I had dismantled his future emotional experience. He kept typing. You're actually insane. This is why fandoms are toxic. You just ruined months of reading. That line, ruin months of reading. I leaned back in my chair and let out the slowest breath. Months. Exactly. That's what he had ahead of him. Late nights. Cliffhangers, theories forming in his head. He would have gasped at book 8. He would have argued with strangers about book 10. He would have confidently predicted the wrong villain. And now, every page would feel different. Every time a character smiled, he'd remember if they survived or died. Every time two characters formed an alliance, he'd remember whether it shattered later. The tension was gone, not because of a name, but because he decided to turn a harmless comment into a battlefield. He tried to regain control quickly. I didn't read most of it. That was the first attempt at emotional damage. Control. Minimizing exposure, convincing himself the harm was partial. But then came the crack. You're pathetic. When insults resurface after panic, it means the person is scrambling. He wanted to push the dynamic back to where it started him. Superior, me inferior. But the power had shifted. He wasn't lecturing me about spoiler etiquette anymore. He was reacting. Defensive, angry, disoriented, and the strangest thing, I didn't feel explosive joy. I felt calm satisfaction, the kind that settles in your chest like warm tea. Not chaotic revenge, controlled correction. I finally responded with one sentence. Now that's a spoiler. I kept it short on purpose. Minimalism can feel colder than paragraphs. He responded almost instantly. You're proud of this. I paused before replying, not because I was unsure, but because pacing matters. No, I type. I'm just not embarrassed anymore. That was the truth. This stopped being about the book the moment he tried to humiliate me publicly. He wanted me defensive, apologetic, smaller. Instead, I showed him what real impact looked like. His messages started coming in waves. First anger, you could get banned for that. Then bargaining. Delete it, as if unread knowledge could be erased. Then justification, you overreacted. And there it was, the pivot. Suddenly my reaction was the problem, not his disrespect. That psychological flip fascinates me. When someone pokes you repeatedly and you finally push back, they call you dramatic, excessive, emotional. But actions have weight. And he miscalculated mine. Asterisk, I didn't respond again. Silence is a mirror. People start talking to fill it. He kept messaging. I only said that because you wouldn't admit you were wrong. Translation. I insulted you because you didn't submit. You didn't have to take it personally. But he made it personal. Intelligence isn't about books. It's about identity. And he attacked that first. Now he wanted detachment, distance, safety. About an hour later, he posted again in the subreddit. Not about me directly, but about toxic spoiler behavior. The irony almost made me laugh. He framed himself as someone who had been maliciously targeted. What he didn't say was that he initiated the escalation. He didn't mention low IQ energy. He didn't mention calling me dense. He curated the narrative carefully. And that's when I understood something deeper about him. He wasn't just arrogant, he needed validation. He needed the community to see him as the reasonable one, the intellectual guardian. But here's what he didn't expect. A few people in the comments questioned him. Someone wrote, "Didn't you start that argument?" Another said, "I saw the thread. It was just a name." He stopped responding after that, and that silence, that was louder than anything else. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I replayed everything in my head, not with guilt, but with reflection. Was it extreme? Yes. Was it calculated? Absolutely. Did it match the crime? Maybe not proportionally, but emotionally, it did. Because this wasn't about spoilers, it was about tone. About the casual entitlement some people feel to belittle others online. The assumption that there are no consequences because there's a screen between you. He messaged one last time the next day. I hope you're happy. I read it twice. Happiness wasn't the word, satisfaction was closer, balance even closer. I didn't respond, there was nothing left to say. The story was over for him, at least, he could still read the books, but the experience, the suspense, the mystery, that was gone forever. Every page would now be filtered through knowledge he wasn't supposed to have yet, and here's the part that surprised me the most. I didn't feel like a villain. I felt like someone who refused to be talked down to, someone who chose not to swallow disrespect quietly. Sometimes revenge isn't about destruction. It's about demonstration. He demonstrated arrogance. I demonstrated consequence. He thought I ruined his experience with a name, so I showed him what ruin actually looks like. And the most poetic part, I never broke a single public rule. A week passed, then 2. And I genuinely thought that was the end of it. Internet conflicts usually burn fast and die faster, but this one lingered in a strange way. Not because he kept messaging me, he didn't. Not because the subreddit exploded into drama, it didn't. It was quieter than that, subtler, and somehow more satisfying. One evening, I was scrolling through the subreddit again, not even thinking about him, when I saw a post that made my lips slowly curve upward. The username was familiar, the title read something like, "Struggling to stay motivated after major spoilers." I clicked it, of course I did. He didn't mention me. He didn't explain how it happened. He framed it vaguely, said he had accidentally come across significant endgame information, and now the suspense felt diminished. That word did something to me. It was clinical, detached. Like he was trying to intellectualize disappointment instead of admit devastation. He wrote about how knowing certain character fates made earlier chapters feel hollow. How plot twists no longer hit the same. How it felt like reading a script instead of living a story. And as I read his paragraph, I remembered exactly how those twists felt the first time: the shock, the heartbreak, the confusion, the anger at fictional betrayals, the tears, the late-night pacing in my room after finishing a brutal chapter. He would never have that now, not authentically. The comments under his post were mixed. Some people empathized, said spoilers can ruin long series. Others told him to focus on the journey, not the destination. A few bluntly said, "That's what happens when you argue online." That one made me pause, so some people had connected the dots. Interesting. He responded to most comments politely, almost humbly. That caught my attention. Gone was the condescending tone. Gone was the intellectual superiority. He sounded subdued, careful with his wording. Measured. It was subtle, but it was there. Something had shifted, and here's where things get psychologically fascinating. I expected to feel triumph when I saw that post. I expected a rush. Instead, what I felt was quieter, deeper. It wasn't joy at his frustration, it was recognition. He finally understood impact, not theoretically, not academically, practically, emotionally. He now knew what it felt like to have an experience altered by someone else's actions. The irony was almost poetic. He accused me of ruining something small, then experienced what real ruin felt like. But I won't pretend I didn't revisit our message thread that night. I did. I scrolled back to his original insult. Low IQ. Energy. I read it again, not with anger, but with analysis. It's interesting how power dynamics flip. At the beginning, he was certain, authoritative, confident in his judgment of me. By the end, he was asking me to delete messages, telling me I overreacted, hoping I'd respond so he could regain footing. There's a specific moment in any conflict where control changes hands. It's almost invisible when it happens, but once it does, you can feel it. And that moment was when he realized I wasn't going to play the submissive role he assigned me. Another week passed, and I noticed something else. He stopped correcting people as aggressively in other threads. I'm not exaggerating. I checked. His comment history had softened, still opinionated, but less sharp, less insulting. He disagreed without name-calling. He explained instead of belittling. And I don't know if that was because of me specifically, but I can't ignore the timing. When someone experiences consequences directly tied to their behavior, even subtle ones, it leaves a mark. One night, lying in bed, I asked myself the question everyone probably listening is thinking: did I go too far? 14 books is a lot. Months of reading, emotional investment. Was it disproportionate? Maybe. But proportionality in emotional exchanges isn't always linear. It's layered. He didn't just accuse me of a spoiler, he attacked my intelligence, publicly, repeatedly. He attempted to humiliate me in front of a community I valued. That has weight, and what I did, it was private, contained. I didn't screenshot it. I didn't expose him. I didn't drag him publicly. I kept it between us. In a strange way, that restraint mattered to me. There's also something important about intention. I didn't wake up wanting to ruin someone's reading experience. I reacted to disrespect. And I chose the exact pressure point he cared about most. Not his job, not his real life, not his identity outside the forum, just the thing he weaponized: his intellectual superiority about a fictional world. I targeted the arena he stepped into willingly. A month later, he made another post. This one was about reaching book 9. He admitted that even though he knew certain outcomes, he was trying to focus on character development instead of twists. That line stayed with me. Trying. The original magic was gone. But he was adapting. And in a way, that's what reading is about, to adapting to what you know and finding meaning anyway. I almost respected that. But here's the twist in my own psychology. The longer time passed, the clearer my internal shift became. I didn't feel vindictive anymore. I felt validated. That's the word. Validated, not because he suffered, but because I proved to myself that I don't have to quietly absorb disrespect, that I can respond strategically instead of emotionally spiraling, that I'm not obligated to educate someone who insults me. There's power in refusing to argue and instead demonstrating consequence, and sometimes the most satisfying revenge isn't watching someone explode, it's watching them adjust. I never messaged him again. He never messaged me again. We coexist in that subreddit now like strangers who once shared a secret war. Occasionally, I see his username under theory posts. He's calmer now, less absolute, less condescending. Maybe coincidence, maybe not. But every time I see someone accuse another user of spoiling something trivial, I think back to that night. To the steady way my fingers moved across the keyboard, to the silence after I pressed send, to the notification that simply said delivered. And I remember that sometimes people learn empathy the hard way. He wanted to make me feel small over a name. Instead, I showed him how fragile anticipation really is, and the truth. I still don't feel bad. The strange thing about revenge is that people imagine it as loud, explosive, dramatic. They imagine shouting matches, public humiliation, slamming doors. But the most effective revenge I've ever experienced was quiet. It happened in the soft glow of my laptop screen. No one applauded, no one gasped. There was no cinematic soundtrack swelling in the background, just a message sent, a story altered. An experience permanently changed. And the older I get, the more I realize that power doesn't always look like dominance. Sometimes it looks like composure. Months passed. The subreddit moved on, like the internet always does. New readers joined, old debates resurfaced, fan art cycles repeated, and yet, every so often, I would see his username and feel that faint flicker of memory. Not anger, not even triumph. Just awareness. We had shared a moment where the illusion of superiority shattered, and here's what fascinates me most about the entire situation. He never apologized, not once, even after everything, even after realizing how deeply he had miscalculated. Instead, he shifted tone, softer, measured, controlled, as if the lesson embedded itself quietly without acknowledgement. And I thought about that a lot. Why do some people struggle to apologize? Why is it easier to double down, to insult, to deflect, rather than say, I overreacted? I think it's because apology requires vulnerability, and vulnerability feels like losing. For someone who builds their identity around being the smartest person in the room, admitting fault feels like collapse, so instead, they protect the ego at all costs, even if it means escalating a harmless situation into something irreversible. But here's the part that surprised me about myself. I didn't feel like I won. I felt like I reclaimed something. There's a difference. Winning implies competition. Reclaiming implies restoration. In that first thread, when he called me dense and low IQ, there was a subtle attempt to define me, to shrink me into something lesser. And for a brief moment, I felt that sting, that tiny doubt that creeps in when someone attacks your intelligence, not because you believe them, but because being spoken to that way triggers something older. Something ingrained from years of subtle dismissals. And when I sent that message, it wasn't about destroying his books. It was about refusing to accept that definition. I replayed the entire arc in my head one night like it was its own novel. The inciting incident, a name, the rising tension, condescension masked as moral outrage, the escalation, public belittling. The turning point, private message, the climax, irreversible knowledge, the falling action, humbled tone, and the resolution, silence. It was almost poetic that a story about fantasy literature became its own contained narrative of pride and consequence. There's also something deeply ironic about the fact that the entire 14-book series we were arguing over centers around themes of power, arrogance, and downfall. The main antagonist in that world rises because he believes himself intellectually superior. He manipulates, dismisses, underestimates, and ultimately, that arrogance blinds him to his own vulnerability. I sometimes wonder if he ever recognized that parallel while reading, knowing the ending the way he did. And let's talk about that ending for a second. Because if you've ever finished a long series, you know the kind of ache it leaves behind. The hollow feeling after the final page, the quiet processing. The way you sit there staring at the wall because a world you lived in for months just ended. He never got that pure version of it. He read toward inevitability instead of mystery, toward confirmation instead of discovery. Every emotional spike was flattened by prior knowledge, and that's not something you can undo. There's no reset button for first experiences. But here's the truth I don't say lightly. I don't regret it. I've examined it from every angle. I've questioned my proportionality. I've weighed the ethics. And every time, I return to the same conclusion. He chose escalation first. He chose humiliation first. He chose to weaponize intellect first. I responded strategically, not impulsively. I didn't dox him. I didn't threaten him. I didn't expose him publicly. I altered a fictional journey. That was the scope. Some people will say, it's just books. Exactly. It was just books. And if it was just books, then he shouldn't have used them as a platform to degrade someone. If a fictional name triggered that level of hostility from him, then perhaps the experience was already fragile. What I learned from this wasn't about spoilers. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about boundaries. We are taught, especially as women, to smooth things over, to de-escalate, to keep peace, to let comments slide, to be the bigger person. And sometimes that's wise. But sometimes being the bigger person simply enables smaller behavior. Sometimes people only recalibrate when they feel consequence. And no, I don't go around ruining series for people. I'm not sitting in subreddits waiting to strike. This wasn't habitual cruelty. It was a response to targeted disrespect, a reminder that anonymity doesn't erase accountability. I've also thought about what would have happened if he had responded differently in the beginning. If he had simply said, "Hey, I'm early in the series, could you tag that?" I would have apologized instantly, genuinely, without ego. Because tone matters, intent matters. But he didn't choose that route. He chose superiority, and superiority invites challenge. There's one more detail I've never shared. A few months after everything settled, he replied to someone in a thread about fandom etiquette, and he wrote, "Sometimes it's better to assume good intent before attacking someone." I stared at that sentence for a long time, because that was the lesson, not about spoilers, about intent. If he had assumed I wasn't malicious, none of this would have happened. If he had extended basic respect, he would have finished 14 books with wonder instead of for knowledge. I never responded to that comment. I didn't need to. The story had already concluded. And here we are, a conflict that started with a name ended with a shift in power, perspective, and perhaps even personality. I don't know if he thinks about it anymore. I don't know if he still feels that sting when a major plot point unfolds exactly as he was warned. It would. But I know this. I walk into online spaces differently now. Not harsher, not colder, just firmer, less willing to absorb unnecessary condescension. Sometimes revenge isn't about hurting someone. It's about reminding them they're not untouchable. He wanted me embarrassed. Instead, I became unforgettable. And if you're listening to this wondering whether you should always be the bigger person, I'll leave you with this. Being bigger doesn't mean being silent. It means choosing your response intentionally, and sometimes, intention hits harder than impulse ever could. If this story made you feel something, satisfaction, discomfort, validation, even disagreement, hit that like button. It helps more than you think. Subscribe if you want more deep dive revenge stories that aren't just about drama, but about psychology and power. And tell me in the comments, was I justified? Or did I go too far? I genuinely want to know where you stand, because in the end, every story has two sides, but only one ending, and sometimes, you get to decide what that ending is.